So sometimes we wore funny hats to say this scene we don't like. They don't like this one.
We just did this thing. That was when they were going to sue us for.
They were the two funniest women on television. Everyone loved them. But behind the laughs, something was quietly falling apart. And the two men responsible weren't who you'd expect. Lenny and Squiggy weren't just characters. To Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall, they were co-workers, confidants, and eventually, the center of attention that the cast barely talked about for decades. So why did it take this long for both women to finally speak? In 1978, Laverne and Shirley was the most watched show on American television. Not one of the most watched. The most watched. 60 million people tuned in every single week. That number is almost impossible to understand in today's fragmented streaming world. To put it in perspective, the Super Bowl that same year drew 78 million viewers. Laverne and Shirley was pulling numbers that close to the Super Bowl every single week. That kind of viewership doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people genuinely believe what they're watching. And audiences believed in Laverne DeFazio and Shirley Feeney completely. They believed in the cramped Milwaukee apartment. They believed in the bottle capping factory. They believed in the friendship. Loud, messy, unconditional, real. And when Lenny and Squiggy came crashing through that door with their leather jackets and their absolutely unhinged energy, audiences believed in that too. What nobody was asking was whether the people behind those characters believed in each other. Penny Marshall grew up in the Bronx. Her father ran a film production company. Her brother Gary was already carving his name in Hollywood before she got her first real break. She came into the industry with connections, yes, but also with a chip on her shoulder the size of a city block. She was funny in a way that felt almost accidental, like she wasn't trying to perform comedy so much as she simply couldn't help it. Her comedic instincts were bone deep. Cindy Williams came from a completely different place. She grew up in Texas and then Los Angeles, trained seriously as an actress, and earned her credibility the slow way. Through auditions, through small roles, through grinding it out in an industry that wasn't handing anything to anyone. Before Laverne and Shirley, she had been in American Graffiti. She had worked with Francis Ford Coppola. She took her craft seriously in a way that sometimes made the casual chaos of a sitcom set feel like an uncomfortable fit. Two women. Two completely different relationships with what it meant to be on camera. And yet, they worked. Somehow, they worked better than almost anything else on television. What the audience saw was two best friends who happened to be hilarious. What was actually happening was two very different people finding a professional rhythm that looked, from the outside, like something deeper. That distinction matters, because when professional rhythms break down, and they always eventually do, there's nothing underneath to hold the pieces together. Michael McKean and David Lander have been performing as Lenny and Squiggy since their college days at Carnegie Mellon. They didn't audition as separate actors hoping to be cast together. They arrived as a unit. They had years of history, years of inside language, years of trust built in rehearsal rooms and small comedy clubs before a single camera ever pointed at them. When they walked onto the Laverne and Shirley set, they already knew exactly who they were. That kind of confidence is magnetic. It's also quietly a little bit excluding. The show looked like an ensemble, but the energy on set told a more complicated story. And the people who noticed that most were the two women whose names were in the title. But the smiles you saw every week, some of them were being held together by nothing more than professionalism. And that was already starting to crack. That crack didn't show up in the tabloids. It didn't show up in interviews. It showed up in the small moments. Who laughed at whose joke, who got the extra beat of screen time, who walked off set feeling seen, and who walked off feeling managed. To understand what was really happening on that set, you have to understand what McKean and Lander actually were before the show existed. They met at Carnegie Mellon University in the late 1960s. They weren't assigned to work together. They gravitated toward each other the way people do when they find someone who speaks the same comic language. By the time they graduated, Lenny and Squiggy weren't just characters. They were a fully developed act. They performed them at clubs. They refined them over years. When Gary Marshall cast them on Laverne and Shirley in 1976, he wasn't building something new. He was borrowing something already finished. That's a rare thing in television. Most cast members are figuring out their characters in real time, during table reads, in early episodes, and awkward rehearsals. McKean and Lander already knew exactly how to move, how to time a line, how to own a room. They arrived with confidence that read as effortless, because for them, it genuinely was. For Penny and Cindy, it was not effortless. They were building Laverne and Shirley from scratch, week by week, episode by episode. And they were doing it while sharing screen space with two men who already had a decade of chemistry locked in. What nobody reported at the time was how that imbalance quietly shaped the atmosphere on set. McKean and Lander's entrance into any scene carried a kind of gravitational pull. Writers knew how they worked. Directors knew what to expect. The laugh track knew when they were coming. And Penny and Cindy, whose show this technically was, sometimes found themselves reacting to Lenny and Squiggy rather than driving the story themselves. Penny handled this in a way Penny handled most things, by getting sharper, funnier, more physical. She leaned into Laverne's bluntness and made it a weapon. It worked, but it also meant she was constantly performing at full output just to hold her own space. Cindy's response was different. She pulled inward. Shirley became more earnest, more emotional, more of a counterweight to the chaos around her. That worked too, but it also meant the two women, without ever discussing it, were drifting into slightly different orbits. They cared about each other. That part was real. But caring about someone and competing with them for air in the same room are not mutually exclusive. Both things were true at the same time, and neither woman was fully ready to say that out loud. I want to ask you something before we go further. Did you always think Laverne and Shirley were genuine best friends off screen? Or did something about their dynamic always feel just slightly too performed to be the whole story? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, because the answer most people give is more divided than you'd think. And then the ratings started shifting, and with them, so did everything else. The ratings shift didn't just change the numbers. It changed the conversations happening behind closed doors, and some of those conversations had dollar signs attached to them. By the early 1980s, Laverne and Shirley was still a hit. But the cultural moment that had made it untouchable in 1978 was softening. Network television was changing. Audiences were changing. And inside Paramount, the people holding the checkbooks were starting to make decisions that reflected that shift, decisions that landed hardest on the woman whose name came second in the title. Cindy Williams married actor and comedian Bill Hudson in 1982. She became pregnant shortly after. And when she approached the production about adjusting her filming schedule to accommodate her pregnancy, the response she got was not what she expected from a show she had helped build from the ground up. The details of what happened next have been reported in fragments over the years. A lawsuit here, a statement there. But the full picture is more complicated than any single headline captured. Cindy filed a lawsuit against Paramount in 1982, alleging breach of contract. The specific claim was that the production had violated agreements about her working hours and conditions. But underneath the legal language was something much more personal. She was a pregnant woman asking for basic accommodations on a set where she was supposedly a co-equal star. And she was being told, in various ways both direct and indirect, that the schedule mattered more than she did. What made this situation almost impossibly painful was one specific fact that most coverage glossed over entirely. The producer of Laverne and Shirley was Gary Marshall, and Gary Marshall was Penny's brother. Sit with that for a moment. Cindy wasn't fighting a faceless studio executive. She was in dispute with her co-star's own family. Every conversation she had with Paramount was, by extension, a conversation that touched Penny Marshall personally. Every grievance she raised put Penny in the position of choosing, not overtly, not with a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet daily calculus of where her loyalty lived. Penny never publicly took a side. That was probably the only move available to her. But not taking a side, when your brother holds the power and your co-star is the one without it, is itself a choice. And Cindy knew that. The lawsuit was eventually settled. The terms were not disclosed. Cindy's character Shirley Feeney was written out of the show, first given a storyline that moved her character to California, then quietly phased out as the series limped toward its 1983 cancellation. The show didn't survive her exit by long, but by the time it ended, Cindy was already gone, not just from the set, but from something harder to name. Here is the part that almost nobody reported correctly. This was never purely about money. Performers at that level fight contract battles all the time. What made this one different was the specific erasure involved. Cindy Williams had spent 6 years building Shirley Feeney into one of the most recognized characters on American television. She had done that work on a show that bore her image, her voice, her physical comedy, her timing. And when she needed the most basic human consideration, accommodation during a pregnancy, the institution she had built that show for treated her request like an inconvenience. That is not a salary dispute. That is a message. And Cindy received it clearly. She didn't speak about it with real openness for years afterward. In interviews, she was diplomatic, measured, careful. The lawsuit had ended. The show had ended. There was nothing left to fight publicly. But the thing she carried out of that building, that specific feeling of having been made to feel replaceable inside your own story, that stayed. If this story is already hitting different than you expected, what the two of them actually said when they finally broke their silence is the part this channel exists for. Make sure you're subscribed before the next chapter. Cindy didn't just leave the show. She left with something she'd never fully say out loud, until now. Cindy carried something out of that building that she couldn't fully name in public. But Penny was carrying something too, and hers was heavier in a different way because it had no clean target. When you're the one who stayed, the silence looks different from the outside. Penny Marshall didn't fight Cindy. She didn't issue statements. She didn't give interviews where she positioned herself as the wrong party or the loyal one or anything else with a clear moral shape. She just continued. She showed up. She finished the show. And when reporters asked her about Cindy, which they did constantly for years afterward, she answered in the careful way that people answer when they're protecting more than one thing at the same time. What she was protecting was complicated. There was her brother. Gary Marshall wasn't just a producer to Penny. He was the person who had opened the first real door for her in this industry. Her first major television role, Myrna on The Odd Couple, came through Gary. Her casting on Laverne and Shirley came through Gary. That is not a small debt to carry. It is also not a simple one, because owing your career to a family member means that when that family member is on the wrong side of something, you don't get the luxury of clean outrage. You get silence. You get careful words. You get that half-second pause before answering. There was also her marriage. Penny had divorced actor Rob Reiner in 1981, the same period when the contract dispute with Cindy was building toward its breaking point. Her personal life was being picked apart in the press at the exact moment her professional life was fracturing. She was dealing with both of those things simultaneously, in public, without the option of simply logging off and processing privately. There was no logging off in 1982. And underneath all of it was something Penny rarely talked about directly, her own uncertainty about what came next. The show was ending. Her identity as Laverne DeFazio, a character she had inhabited for 8 years, was closing. What she wanted was to direct. But wanting to direct and being taken seriously as a director are two entirely different things, especially for a woman in Hollywood in the early 1980s who was known primarily for physical comedy on a network sitcom. She didn't have the luxury of being loud. Loud cost something, and Penny was already overdrawn. Most of us have had someone in our lives we drifted from, not because of a fight, not because of hate, but because life just pulled you in directions that made staying close feel impossible. Penny and Cindy had that, except their drift happened on camera, in tabloids, and in front of 60 million people who thought they already knew the whole story. In later interviews, the ones she gave after her directorial career had long been established. After the pressure had eased, Penny came closest to honesty about this period. She acknowledged in her 2012 memoir, My Mother Was Nuts, that the end of Laverne and Shirley was painful in ways that went beyond the professional. She wrote about Cindy without hostility, but also without the full warmth you'd expect from someone describing their closest collaborator. It read like someone describing a relationship they had mourned and then carefully set down. That gap between what she wrote and what you'd hope she'd written, that gap says everything. She directed big. She directed A League of Their Own. She became one of the most successful directors in Hollywood. And still, in almost every late interview, someone asked about Cindy, and Penny always paused just a half-second too long. That half-second pause had a shelf life. And by the mid-2000s, it was finally starting to expire. Both women had spent the 1980s and 1990s building separate lives, separate careers, separate identities that had nothing to do with Milwaukee and bottle caps and a television show that had once consumed nearly a decade of their lives. The distance helped. Distance usually does. It gives you enough room to look back without flinching, or at least without flinching as visibly. Cindy spoke first, in the way that people who were wronged usually do. Not aggressively, not with a list of grievances, but with the particular clarity that comes when enough time has passed that the anger has cooled into something more useful, something closer to perspective. In interviews throughout the 2000s, she began addressing the departure from Laverne and Shirley with more honesty than she had allowed herself before. She talked about the pregnancy accommodations. She talked about feeling like the institution had prioritized the production schedule over her basic dignity as a person. She didn't name Gary Marshall as a villain. She didn't position Penny as a betrayer. But she stopped performing the version of the story where everything had simply worked out fine. That performance, she had quietly retired. What was striking about these interviews was not the anger. There wasn't much of it left by then. What was striking was the sadness underneath. Cindy talked about Laverne and Shirley the way people talk about a house they love that burned down. She could describe every room perfectly. She remembered exactly what it felt like to be inside it, and she grieved it, not the show itself, but the possibility of what it could have been if the ending had been different. Penny's openness came slower and softer, which was consistent with everything else about how she handled this story. But it came. In promotional interviews for her memoir, and in television appearances during her later years, she said things she had never quite said before. She acknowledged that the split with Cindy had been painful. She acknowledged that the Marshall family dynamic had made her position impossible in ways that were unfair to everyone involved. She didn't use the word guilt, but she used words that lived in the same neighborhood. And then there was the question of Lenny and Squiggy. Here is something that almost nobody has pointed out directly. In all the interviews both women gave across 2 decades of gradually opening up, neither of them ever spoke critically about McKean and Lander. Not once. Not even in passing. And that silence is its own kind of answer. Because if the power imbalance on that set had genuinely hurt them, the natural human response would include at least some friction, some ambivalence, some complicated feeling toward the men at the center of it. The fact that there was none, that both women spoke about McKean and Lander with consistent warmth and even affection, suggests something important. The problem was never actually Lenny and Squiggy. The problem was the system around them, the studio, the family dynamics, the industry's specific cruelty toward women who asked for things that male stars were simply given. McKean and Lander were products of that system the same as everyone else. They benefited from it without designing it. That distinction mattered to Cindy and Penny, and the fact that they both held onto it separately across decades says something real about who they were. Penny Marshall died on December 17, 2018. She was 75 years old. The cause was complications from diabetes. Cindy Williams released a statement. It was short. It was not dramatic. It did not reach for poetry or perform grief for an audience. It simply said that Penny had been a unique talent, a genuine force, and that working beside her had been one of the privileges of her life. She said Penny was irreplaceable. She said it simply, without performance. And somehow, that quiet sentence said everything the two of them never managed to say to each other in time. And if this story sat with you, the kind that feels bigger than just Hollywood gossip, the next video already uploaded on this channel covers a friendship between 2 entertainers that collapsed in a single phone call, and neither of them ever fully explained why. It's already there. Go watch it.